Hi, welcome to my first lecture on the Sicilian defense. This Sicilian defense starts off by playing e4, and then black responds by playing c5, and this is the Sicilian defense. So here's some basic information about the Sicilian defense. The name actually comes from the translation of an Italian manuscript, I think in about the year 1810 or so. And it was popular in the early 1800s, but it then fell out of favor or popularity in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. In fact, I think there's some comments by some world champion or world-class players in the early 1900s about how bad the Sicilian defense was. But it was then revived in about the 1940s and 1950s. And then now, it is now the most popular response to white playing e4. I think it's like 20% or so of all master level games that start off e4 end up being a Sicilian defense. And what is the idea behind the Sicilian defense? Well, the basic idea is that black plans to meet d4. Remember when I talked about the basics of a king's pawn opening? White wants to play d4. It's one of the objectives. Well, black plans to capture on the d4 pawn with the c pawn. This will give black a central pawn majority, which will help control the center, which is one of the objectives of the opening. But this will give white a lead in development. Okay, so that's the basic idea. And maybe just to recap some of the ideas, just to contrast them, let's compare this. So let's just back up. Before I talked about e5, where white plans to fight toe for toe or black plans to fight with white toe for toe in the center. And I've talked about, let me take back this move, and I've talked about e6, which is the French defense, where black wants to maintain a pawn in the center but will give up mobility. I've talked about c6, where it's almost the opposite of Sicilian defense. This and the Caro-Kann. I forgot what I call this. I think I might just refer to it as a Sicilian defense, but c6 is the Caro-Kann defense. And in the Caro-Kann, black plans to give up a center pawn so that he can have development. Where if you contrast this with the Sicilian defense, black is sort of going to go behind in development, but he's going to have more central pawns. So it's sort of a, reverse cousin to the Caro-Kann. So let me take this move back. So c5 is the Sicilian. Now let's go over the basic plans for white and black. So, and remember, these are basic plans. Actual plans will be very specific to the variation, but these generally hold true. So white's idea, let me just maybe try to space this over. White's basic plan is develop as soon as possible. And it's almost always the case in every opening. I have this down, but it's really true. And what's going to happen is that since in the Sicilian defense, white's going to have more kingside space, that's probably where he wants to develop his pieces. And then, and also, white's going to develop quickly as possible because black's going to have to make a pawn move or two so that he can get his pieces out. And while black is making these pawn moves, white will have the opportunity to get his pieces out, which will translate into a lead in development and possible attack. And then the next plan is almost always in the Sicilian defense, black will castle kingside. So we know that if you're playing white, then you can already guessed that you're going to be attacking king side, since that's where the king is going. And depending upon the variation, my next point, white can castle to either side, and it's really going to depend on the variation. And then maybe the general theme of the Sicilian is white is fighting for control of the light colored squares, especially the center light colored squares. Okay, now let's look at black's basic plan. If I just scroll down. As I said before, he plans to trade his c-pawn for white's d-pawn. And this will give him more center pawns, which equals more central control. And when he trades off that c-pawn, it's going to give him the half-open c-file. Okay, so now this c-file here, once it's traded off, is going to be open. And black can use that for an attack. So the next thing is black is generally going to attack queen's side. If white's going to be attacking king side, black's going to be attacking queen side. And then I put down the central strike. If you don't know, when white attacks on the king side, a lot of times by advancing his G, or F, G, and H pawns, one of the best tactics against this sort of king side advance of the pawns is for black to strike in the center, but it has to be timed right. So a central strike, remember that. So you got to think, okay, if I'm black, I'm probably going to be attacking queen side, and I may have to do a central strike when white starts advancing, his pawns are attacking. And then the next thing is black aim is to control the dark colored squares, especially the central dark squares. And then my last two things is that black will often double his rooks on the c-file since it's half open. And then a possibility, especially if white has castled queen side, is that to sacrifice the rook for the knight on c3. So a lot of times there'll be this knight sitting on this square, and then black will have a rook sitting let's say on this square, or even doubled. Let's say it was sitting there and his rook's doubled, is to come down and take the knight that would be here. What this does, especially if the king is there, is that it may create weaken the, it will disrupt the pawn structure around the king and create a bunch of what they call holes around the king. I use this technique actually in one game. I played a casual game where white actually castled the king side, and I was actually able to grab, for the rook, I was able to grab the knight and two pawns and actually break through on the queen side, which led to my eventual win. So I don't know if I would have tried that in an actual tournament game, but casual, I saw that I could get the knight for two pawns and just went for it. So let's go over the basic variations. So the basic variations, so here's the opening to the Sicilian. The basic responses that white can try are knight f3, knight c3, and c3. Knight f3 is called the open defense, which is played almost all the time, 78% of the time. The closed defense, which is played about 10% of the time, and Alapin's variation, which is played about 7% of the time. Now, I know I'm going to get a comment about my pronunciation of the variations, and maybe I should look them up online to see how to pronounce these, and I always appreciate the emails, but I am terrible at pronouncing the names. So, here, let's just look at these real quick. I'm not going to go into them in detail. So the open variation is this move, the knight move to here. The closed variation is this move to here. And then our knight to c3, and then the Alapin's variation, this move here. Okay, those are the three basic responses in the white has, their second move. And now I'm going to cover these in the separate lectures, and no doubt I may have to spend 2, possibly 3 lectures just on the open defense because there's so many material there, and I could probably just spend 1 lecture covering the closed defense